Jesus had the dignity after betraying Christianity to hang himself. Gorbachev is still running around the world picking up pieces of silver. Must be clear here and not confused. I'm a socialist. One other thing I must tell you now. They confuse people about socialism. Brother the other day said, why ain't no socialist? I said, why not, brother? He said, because it's a white thing. I said, oh, really? You see, Europe tries to make believe that everything that comes out of the world comes out of Europe. I told the man, I said, socialism ain't no white thing. He said, yes, it is. He said, Karl Marx discovered it. I told him, Karl Marx never discovered socialism. He cannot. You call the laws of gravity Newton's laws. I'm sure there's a mnemonic device to help you on your quizzes. But you certainly cannot believe that Isaac Newton can found that a body falls at the rate of 32 feet per second squared per second squared. He can't find this. He can't discover it. He cannot invent this. He can only observe it and record it, discover the law. If I'm sitting in Timbuktu in Africa, and I've never heard of Sir Isaac Newton, and I'm conducting any experiments with gravity, I will come to the same conclusion that he does. A body in motion tends to stay in motion unless stopped by an outside force. He cannot invent this. He can only observe it and record it. Marx did not invent socialism. If I'm sitting in Libya, in the deserts, and I'm doing any research with capital and labor without ever having heard of Karl Marx, I will come to the same conclusion that he did. That any time capital seeks to dominate labor, there'll be a ruthless, uncompromising struggle on the part of labor until it comes to crush capital and dominate it. This is a fact. My history demonstrates that. We came here as chattel slaves for centuries. We fought and fought and fought until we crushed it. Now we're just slave of the wage, and now we've got to rise up and crush that one. That's to declare that Karl Marx didn't invent socialism. It's there for all to see. Karl Marx's great contribution to the world was in the area of historical materialism and dialectical materialism, something you need to know if you know about socialism. But since you don't know about socialism, you don't even know the words. And not only does the enemy keep you ignorant, you stay ignorant. You won't ever go read a book about socialism. Why read a book about socialism? They already told me in my class it ain't no good. You will not even read a book about socialism. Why, you don't even read a book about your history. We come to inspire you to learn. We come to tell you that when you come to serve a people, you must know as much as you can. The more you know, the better able you are to serve the people.
All right. Thank you guys very much. That Kwame Touré video is one of my favorite videos of him talking about Marxism and people calling Marxism a white man's thing. I was actually getting into that conversation earlier today with a friend of mine before I even started kind of putting clips together for the show. I was telling her what the show was going to be about. And I said, yeah, we're going to ask the question, does Marxism work for Black people? And she definitely kind of went off. So I'm hoping that she is watching. She said she was going to watch and contribute some interesting questions to this. I do first want to introduce my show co-host that will be hosting the shows with me from here on out. You may remember him from last week's stream, Pasquale Robert.
Yes, thank you for having me here. Jason, don't forget to check out my work in Black Agenda Report, Huffington Post, and various other publications. I'm looking forward to tonight's show.
So here we are in the midst of a deadly pandemic that has to date infected, was it 17 million plus people in the States alone. It's taken the lives of over 311,000 as of 2 days ago. And I believe the total is even higher now by another 2,000 plus. We have a governing body that was too busy protecting the interests of capital than to protect the interests of its people. Of the 311 plus thousand dead, Black, Hispanic, and Native populations are not just dying at a higher rate, they're actually dying younger. As a study has shown, there's also some WHO data and some CDC data to back this up. I can put some links in the description of the show. With the contagious virus ripping through cities at an unparalleled rate, a shutdown of the economy was in order to try to stop the intense spread and flatten the curve. Without a strong moratorium on rent and mortgages, coupled with one-time payments of $1,200, evictions have already started in the U.S. in numerous cities, even here in California. A study from the Aspen Institute actually said, a study from this August said that we're looking at possibly 30 to 40 million people evicted from their homes, increasing the ever-growing homeless population in the richest nation of the world. We're looking at, I think they said another $600 in one-time payments from the government with no universal health care on the horizon. The controlling duopoly is failing the majority of poor and working class Americans. The incoming Biden administration ran on restoring the soul of America with a cabinet of firsts. We have the first Native American woman. We have the first openly gay man. Trotting out all these firsts means very little when the politics of a lot of these people are in line with the people they're replacing from the previous administration. All that being said, sorry, the dog is barking. He wants to get out. Can we admit that capitalism has failed a majority of Americans? And can we start to now look for an alternative system to help us out? I ask you, Pasquale.
Well, the reality is capitalism is a long process that has cycles of boom and bust. Sometimes the booms are big, and sometimes the busts are small. But the economic model as a system is admitted by its enthusiasts to require certain crashes of whether it's 5, 10, 15-year periods of time. And what we have witnessed, particularly since the 2008 crash, is that the crashes are becoming deeper, more damaging, and more long-term in the way in which they are relegating not only large sections of poor and working class people, but even some segments of middle class people to poverty in this environment. And what we have to realize is that, for me, the importance of this endeavor, of this show, and me joining you, is that we have to realize that there was a time when Black people in America rooted their politics in their political economy, realizing that the nature of capitalism in America was not working for them because the way in which they were racially relegated to the reserve army of labor. In other words, capitalism in America always put Black people at the economic margin of labor in this country, because once the surplus redundant labor is racialized in the consciousness of the majority of Americans, then it's easy for them to deny the fact that capitalism is failing them also. And the predecessor movements that African Americans had, going back from slave rebellions to the 19th century populist movement with the Colored Farmers Alliance, to the Black radical Southern agriculture workers, to women like Lucy Parsons, Claudia Jones, men like Hubert Harrison, Cyril Briggs, the African Blood Brotherhood, Paul Robeson, even late Du Bois. Black radicals of the 30s, 20s, 30s, and 40s always rooted their challenge to racism in America and connected it to the way in which capitalism utilizes racism to ensure large segments of Black America are relegated to surplus labor, which means you end up being surplus in prison, which means that you get surplus poverty and all of the things that come with that. And what we have happening in the last 50 years, with a period of time which I call the 50-year counter-revolution, when COINTELPRO and Richard Nixon's policies of endorsing Black capitalism neutralized the radical movement of what the Black Power era aspired to be, and ended up really just creating or facilitating the creation of the Black political class. Black political thought has been stuck in a very conservative direction, which is based on aspirationalism and fulfilling the desires of middle-class Black folk who want to be well facilitated in the system. And I'm not trying to say, listen, I went to law school. I practiced law for a while. I have plenty of friends of mine who are professionals. I'm in one of the oldest Black fraternities in this country. I'm not trying to tell you that middle-class Black people are evil and they're sitting in a room saying, woo ha 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 ha, how are we going to screw over these poor working-class Black folk? It's not that malevolent, and it's not that simple. What I'm telling you is that people base their politics on their class interests. And I'm not telling you that the Black middle class are people who are just demonically evil, want to destroy poor Black people, though some of them might. The reality is that when you have your politics shaped by people whose material interests comes from being successful in the corporate private sector, or getting a C-suite office, or perhaps getting that good membership on a committee in the House and the Senate, more so than understanding why fighting mass incarceration is a priority for working class Black folk, why they might actually like Medicare for all, it's going to create a reality which we are in today, where Black politics is a class politics, and the class politics it caters to is not the politics of the majority of Black people.
Well, we brought on to discuss this with us another friend of show, You may know him from several times coming on this show right now, and I did a podcast with him not too long ago. Dr. Asatar Bair. He is a professor at Riverside Community College. He's a fellow comrade.
Yes, he is. By the way, I want to say one thing about Dr. Bair. The first thing that Dr. Bair said when I told him that we're going to put you on the spot and make you try to explain to Black people what value Marxism has to them, he says, "Do you want me to be the white guy to tell Black people what they should believe in?" I said, No. We're not trying to make you the white guy to tell Black people what they should believe in or think. We want you to be the white guy who is a Marxist, who is a Marxist academic, who studied under the great Richard Wolff, who is something that both myself and Jason respect as a major force in progressive intellectual circles, who talks about a class analysis of American capitalism. And I know many Black folk who like Richard Wolff and who like his analysis. And we would like you to take that analysis, basic and understanding some of the facts that I mentioned earlier, and introduce whether or not you want to be a Marxist as a Black person. I am not an orthodox Marxist. I use Marxism as a tool to challenge capitalism. I use other things as a tool as well. But for me, it's just a tool to challenge capitalism. So
yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think of a metaphor like Kung Fu, like does Kung Fu have a whole philosophy and belief structure and whatever? Yes, right. It comes out of Chinese culture. Of course it does. But it's a tool, right? Like if you want to fight unarmed, then that's a good way to do that, right? And do you need to believe in, do you need to speak Chinese? Do you need to, have all these beliefs? No, right? Like, if somebody's going to come after you and you want to defend yourself, right? That's a tool you can employ, right? And Marxism, similarly, I think, just as you say, is a tool. And if you have ever pondered, gosh, maybe the way that our politics is structured, the way that our economy is structured, doesn't really work for the average person, especially doesn't work for the working class person or the poor person. It definitely doesn't work for the homeless person, right? The person who's about to get evicted, as millions currently are. And how might we structure our economy so that it works for everyone? If those are the kinds of questions that you're interested in, then Marxism is a natural place to go, because Marxism really starts from that premise, right? It says, look, most of economic theory has been created for the rich. It justifies a system which works very well for the rich and does not pay much attention to the average ordinary person and their needs, right? And Marxism takes that kind of orientation first and foremost. So, I think of it as a great tool for, all oppressed peoples, really. I mean, so I don't want to make it too specific, but I think that, if you start to ask those questions, this is a great set of ideas. And whether, again, it's a toolbox, right? So which specific aspects of that, I mean, it's a very rich tradition, right? Which specific aspects of that do you take and which ones do you not use or reject? I think that's all part of that's all part of it, right? And Marxism is not meant to be some kind of, rigid, unyielding thing, right? I mean, the entire thrust of it is, well, we are in a process of change. Each one of us, society's in a process of change. If we don't recognize that, then we're not going to be as effective as we could be, as, if we're aware of the contradictions and so on.
That's a very good way of framing it. Professor Jason, you have anything you want to add?
I just wanted to kind of read some of these comments on the chat. We do try to make this show as interactive as possible. So if you guys have any comments or questions, please write them down, because we will be reading them on the air. I'll be posting them, but sometimes the guests can't see them as I post them. Way to open, Professor Dietz. Wee! I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, by Romello Lewis. Kelly also commented on my shirt. Yes, because there was a versus battle that you young people love. I am repping the Bay Area all day, every day. Okay. PR, I'm assuming that's Pascal Robert. Janice Graham from Our Common Ground is watching the
Great
show.
Janice,
That's pretty dope. Thank you very much.
Great Janice Graham. The great Janice Graham. I consider her a media mentor.
Well, she says, why do we have to admit it? It is a clear fact. Boom and bust. Certain exclusions are built in. And she says, thank you, Pascal. Racial capitalism and systems of colonialism maintain poverty in the U.S. And then you got a truth. So class interests skew how people think and behave. So you probably can't hear, but there is a child banging for me on the outside the door. So Pascal, I'm going to hand this off to you to interrogate Dr. Bair.
Okay. We'll come back soon. So Dr. Bair, as we were talking about what our goal in today's program, but the theme of our show that Jason and I are merging together, right? The goal that we have with this program, and for our audience who's listening, is to reintroduce Black people to their left political traditions, particularly their left political traditions that challenge capitalism, imperialism, racism, and sexism. And that there was a time in this country when Black people realized that all four of those things were related and that you could not be separated in terms of fighting for the liberation of Black people. As we said earlier, and we talked about how Black politics has become conservative during this 50-year period of counter-revolution. So the first thing I would ask you, understanding, as I stated earlier in my commentary, that from the time of slave rebellions to the 19th century Colored Farmers Alliance during the populist era, to the Alabama Black communist sharecroppers, to Lucy Parsons, Hubert Harrison, the Black Socialists, Cyril Briggs, the African Blood Brotherhood, Paul Robeson, late period Du Bois, Dr. Martin Luther King, who, by the way, Dr. Martin Luther King, on meeting Coretta Scott King on the first date, her first comment was, I found him so interesting because he was the first Black socialist that I ever met. That was what Coretta Scott King said about her first date with Martin Luther King. People need to understand how sexy socialism really is, It's going to be hard to convince a lot of people when they see the contemporary left, sadly. Then we go to late period Malcolm X, who Malcolm X famously said, you show me a capitalist and I'll show you a bloodsucker. Onward to the Black Panther Party. All of those movements, this over 100-year history of Black people having movements. Claudia Jones, another Black woman. I have so many books here that talk about Black socialists and communists. Not that you have to be a socialist or a communist. You might want to be a socialist. You may not want to be a communist. Maybe that depends on you. There's a history. The average African American today, the average Black person, if you told them that in the early 20s, over 25% of the Communist Party in Chicago was made up of Black people, they would look at you. That's impossible. If you told them that in Alabama at one time there were Black communists who you would ask them, who are the white communists? They would say, I've never met a white communist in my life. Yet today, in that history, and again, our position is not to say you should be a socialist or you should be a communist. Our position is to show you the historical facts that for over 100 years, Black people rooted their politics in challenging capitalism, racism, imperialism, and sexism. All right? Claudia Jones, Marxist feminist. She has a whole book called Left of Karl Marx. Radical sister, Lucy Parsons. I believe she was an anarchist. Radical sister. So the question becomes, in light of all that tradition, in terms of the space that we're in right now, where literally we have media figures at MSNBC, political scientists on that network trying to paint left politics as a white thing. And I'm not saying that we should herald Bernie Sanders as some kind of white savior. He is not. But the movement that he offered had material policies that would have benefited Black people. The question that becomes, and this is something that Janice Graham has said, socialism is an invisible wall in the lives of Black people, which was, for the majority of Black people's history in this country, not the case. How is Marxism valuable to Black America in changing that invisible wall or making it disappear?
Yeah, that's a great question, and thanks for the background too. I mean, you know, the depth of knowledge that you're bringing here in terms of that history, right? A very rich history of, you know, revolutionary activity and organization, and really attempts to think through what are the unique conditions of capitalism in the United States. Because the United States has a very unique history, right? The United States is not the birthplace of capitalism, right? That's England, right? But the United States is a settler colonial space, right? And it has its unique contradictions, right? And one of those is slavery, right? I mean, you know, the United States had slavery to a much greater extent, much more recently than anything in European history. And and of course that involved, you know, the forcible, you know, theft, kidnapping, you know, of 12 or 13 million Africans, many of whom, of course, died in transit. The majority of them, of course, ended up in the Caribbean and South America, but you know, 1 million or so ended up in the United States, and you know, that produces a unique history, right? That is different from what we see in Europe. And it's very important to produce a concrete analysis of that, and then to say, well, as we transition away from that system and towards the you know, mature capitalism that we have now, it's a racialized form of capitalism. And you know, that it has contradictions which are different than capitalism in other places, right? Different from capitalism in Europe. So, you know, part of the contribution of this Black radical tradition that you mentioned is to develop that, to tell this history, and to give this political economic analysis that we don't often get. You know, we don't, you know, in the way that history is typically taught, and the way that we understand ourselves as a nation, we understand our history, we overlook a lot of things, right? And one of the things we overlook is the class contradictions. And you know, because Marxism is a focus, it has that focus, right? What is the class structure of a society? What are the ways in which it has tensions that are built in? And then for those who are interested in producing change, how can we be aware of what those contradictions are and use them, you know, in order to be more effective or to bring that change?
Thank you. We have a comment from Janice Graham again. White supremacy requires that socialism and Marxism be a boogeyman to maintain its structural control. In other words, she's saying that the system of white supremacy, which is, by the way, a manifestation of capitalism. There is no white supremacy without capitalism. Capitalism is the economic engine of the phenomenon of white supremacy, or Euro-centered global hegemonic control. That allowing socialism and Marxism to be the boogeyman is necessary to maintain that social control, that social and economic control. So one of the things I want to say, and I appreciate the points you've made, is that we want to get into certain specifics and use certain terminology. First of all, what is the reserve army of labor, and why does having Black America being disproportionately relegated to the reserve army of labor facilitate capitalism in the United States? If you can answer that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, you know, in developing this term, Marx is mostly shaped by, you know, Marx is German, right? So he's mostly shaped by European history. That's the history that he knows the best, right? So Marx looks at the system that comes before capitalism, that is feudalism, and says, feudalism is a particular kind of economic system, right? It's a system where you have lords and serfs, right? And the serf they're the ones who perform all the labor, right? Most people are in agriculture, and the serfs are working part of the time on land which they have a traditional right to farm. That is called their tenure, right? A term that's now only used for people like me, right? Professors. And then they're obligated to another part of the time to work on the lord's domain, right? And the lord is going to keep the crops which are grown on their domain. Lords are the only ones who can own land, right? So they own all of the land. But the serf has a kind of traditional right. They're bound by oaths and so forth, right? So, this is European history, right? Everyone has a certain place in the society, right? Serfs have a place. Now, it's not a great place, right? They will have a life of exploitation, and that exploitation is crystal clear, right? So Marx defines exploitation as when the surplus output that you produce, right, that is output which is above and beyond your own needs, socially and biologically constructed needs, is taken by somebody else, right? So in the example that we're talking about, feudalism, right, the feudal lord, that is exploitation. And Marx's insight is, listen, there's a bunch of different kinds of exploitation. Exploitation is very, very prevalent. When we look at history, we find exploitation is a dominant theme. There are different kinds of exploitation, right? So, for example, we could look at slavery, right? Slavery involves another form of exploitation, but it's somebody else is taking your surplus, right? Capitalism is yet another form of exploitation, right? So Marxism comes at it with a very strong ethos, right? It says exploitation is what the problem is, right? We don't want to move from an old kind of exploitation to a fancy new kind of exploitation, right? That's not the goal, right? So I am answering the question, right? The question is, what is the reserve army of labor, or the reserve army of the unemployed? This is a term that, doesn't really exist in the feudal order, right? The feudal order does not really have, it's not defined by the employment relationship, right? So you don't have, as the dominant kind of social relation in production, you do not have wage labor, right? That it exists, but it's marginal, right? Most people are serfs. There's other classes as well, right? There are independent artisans and craftspeople and whatever, right? But the overwhelming majority of people work in agriculture under the relationship that I described, right? Now, as we shift to the development of capitalism, they sever their relationship with the land, right? And some of that is voluntary, right? People move into the cities, they leave their feudal tenure, and then they have all of the problems of being cut off from your subsistence, right? And you don't have the option to go back and farm, so you need employment, otherwise you die, right? I mean, there's no other way of making a living in the city, right? So you have this new phenomenon, which is you have a mass of people who have migrated, right, into the cities, because this is what happens as capitalism develops everywhere, right? We have a shift from the rural countryside to the urban areas. And you have, the number of new jobs that is created by capitalism doesn't always equal the number of migrants, right? I mean, why would they, right? They're driven by different forces after all, right? So we have this growing problem of unemployment, and Marx describes that with this phrase, right? And that seems to be very much endemic to capitalism, right? Because you have, the majority of people, because of the history, cut off from any kind of, in the case of Europe, right, landowning. The United States has a different history, right? The United States has a settler colonial history, okay? So you had the history of the United States is, people were went and claimed land, right? There were times when the government encouraged this and gave out land for free or very low prices and so on to whites, right? Because, that's right. The Africans were an enslaved group, except for like a very small number that were able to either buy their freedom or escape. and so on, right? So, the reserve army of labor, so I know this is a long explanation, but it's like this group which capitalism has created, right, out of the legacy of feudalism, and which serves a particular kind of function in the system, right? That is, capitalism, because the employment relationship is the dominant relationship economically. Well, what happens to you if you do not participate in that employment relationship? Well, I mean, what are your other options, right? I mean, do you have access to land? Can you farm the land? Can you hunt and gather? The thing that humans did for most of human history, right? Well, when all of the land is private property of somebody, the answer is no, right? I mean, unless you have the independent wealth to be able to buy land and start farming it, right? I mean, basically start your own business as a farmer. You do not have that option, right? You must have employment or die, basically. I mean, to put it in stark terms, right? Now, of course, for the Africans who were brought here as slaves, that's a different history than the feudalism in Europe, right? These people were cut off from, their all of the wealth that they had in Africa, right? They're cut off from their language, culture, et cetera, right? There's multiple harms done here. But when slavery ends, you have a group that is released with nothing, right? So, of course, this group is going to, right? They're faced with the same choice that everybody is faced under capitalism, right? Work or die. But with far fewer resources, right? So given that that's the history, of course you're going to find that this group is going to be overrepresented in this reserve army of the unemployed. Absolutely.
Again, now if we looked at hardcore neoliberal capitalists, as some would argue, the founder of neoliberalism, Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman literally stated and believed, and he used the term national rate of unemployment, that there was a rate of unemployment. He was a capitalist. There was a rate of unemployment that was necessary to maintain the function of capitalism in the United States. So this man is telling you that this system, by in and of itself, cannot work for everyone. In order for this system to function, this is Milton Friedman. The capitalists love Milton Friedman out of Chicago, father of neoliberalism, is admitting that you cannot have full employment in capitalism because it will lead to inflation and we will not be able to maintain the structure of the system. What I found out recently in learning that the Federal Reserve was trying to address this, they literally admitted that in order to maintain the national rate of unemployment, which I believe the fancy term they use now is NAIRU. NAIRU is a long explanation, it's like N-A-I-R-U.
Yeah.
In order to maintain the NAIRU, that the Federal Reserve would play with interest rates, either raise them or cut them, to make sure that employers would have to fire people so that it did not affect inflation. That was recently admitted by the Federal Reserve. And if you do not know, the Federal Reserve is nothing but a cartel of private banks making public policy while being controlled largely by private banks. Is that an accurate description of the Federal Reserve, Professor Bair?
Yeah, I mean, the Fed is a very strange government agency. I mean, they're actually organized as a private corporation. It's quite unusual. And of course, they represent exclusively the interests of banks, and of banks, the biggest banks, right? I mean, that's the Fed, right? But yeah, what you mentioned, the NAIRU, that stands for the non-accelerating inflationary rate of unemployment. This is based on this old Keynesian.
That's not confusing.
What's that?
I said that's not confusing.
I know it's a long acronym, right? Yeah, it's like they love to come up with these things to make economics less accessible to the average person, right? I mean, it's based on this old idea of the Phillips curve, right, which says that there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. and that there's an inverse relationship. So that if unemployment gets too low, then inflation is going to be high, and vice versa, right? If unemployment is high, then inflation is low. I mean, there's a lot of conceptual problems with this, but I think you're basically correct in saying these are pro-capitalist people who are indicting capitalism, essentially, right? By saying, hey, we admit that it has these problems, right? I mean, like if you looked at it from the outside and you said, okay, so wait a minute, we can't have both low unemployment, which we know is very, very desirable, right? Like unemployment is correlated with everything bad in society that you could possibly think of, like from a social science perspective, right? It's correlated with suicide, mental illness, depression, anxiety, crime. I mean, list goes on and on, right? It's terrible for society, right? To say that we need a certain amount of that for some reason, like, I mean, and obviously unemployment is the hardest on the people who are themselves unemployed, right? For mainstream economics to basically say fuck these people, I mean, that's a very telling kind of perspective there, I think.
Let me make a little correlation here. So we already have the good white Marxist economists admitting here that Black people are disproportionately reserved for the reserve army of labor, or what Milton Friedman called the national rate of unemployment, right? So if you think of these terms being synonymous, the national rate of unemployment and the reserve labor of army, Professor Bair is telling us that yes, Black people are, by the fact of history, and I would argue intention, reserved to that reserve labor of army or national rate of unemployment, or NAIRU. And
we see it quite clearly in the statistics too. I mean, the unemployment rate, they do break this out by race and gender. I mean, by the categories that the Bureau of Labor Statistics uses. They have white, African American, Asian, and Latino. Those are their categories, right?
Right.
By the peculiar, logic of the United States, right?
Right.
We know that the Black unemployment rate is typically about double the white unemployment rate.
Right.
I mean, and that's been true in the statistics for decades, right? Since they first were.
What's fascinating, right, is when we take it to the extension that, and what you're telling us, they're explaining that unemployment is one of the worst manifestations you can have in an economy because it leads to all this horrible social dislocation.
Yep.
Yet the father of neoliberal capitalism is telling you that this phenomenon that leads to all of this social dislocation that is disproportionately affecting Black people is necessary to have capitalism function. So if that's the case, why exactly are Black people in love with capitalism when the father of modern capitalism is telling you that the national rate of unemployment is necessary, and we know historically that Black people are disproportionately relegated to the national rate of unemployment, or what Marx calls the reserve army of labor, and that Milton Friedman is telling you that is not only natural but necessary to keep that capitalist system functioning, then what Friedman is admitting to you is that it is natural for Black people to be relegated in an American capitalist system to maintain the function of this economy to the economic bottom where they make up that reserve army of labor. So again, why do we have so many Black folk who are in love with capitalism when the system by design disproportionately affects them adversely?
That is the question. I mean, I think it's, Marx talked about the mystification that happens here, right? The mystification through markets. Markets cover up a lot of stuff, right? Like, we don't see the relationships of production. We go to the store and we see prices, right? We don't see how was that produced. We don't see by who was that produced. We don't see class inequality. We don't see class struggle. We just see, oh, that's on sale or not, like that. So there's a mystification here. Like if I said to you, listen, we need to cross this river. There's 100 of us, 95 of us are going to make it. 5 of us are going to die. And then the people said, well, why don't we get better boats? Why don't we get safer boats? And then we said, nah, that'll cost too much money. We want to, there's wealthy among us when they want to keep their money. 5 are going to die. I mean,
I gotta read this quote by my media mentor, Janice Graham, because she's chastising me and I don't want her to think that I'm ignoring her. Janice said, Pascal, stop it. Black people do not support capitalism. They are regulated into it. Okay.
I would add this. There's a really good book by a gentleman that passed away a few years ago named Mark Fisher, and the book is called Capitalist Realism. And I don't know if either one of you guys have checked it out, but it basically says we can imagine. What does Mark Fisher say? We can imagine a world without war before we can imagine a world without capitalism.
Yeah.
And if you really, again, I kind of started the show saying I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who was actually the head of the Black Studies, the African American Studies Department at UC or at UC. Some of the bigger names in Black thought are these major capitalists, and especially when we all of our talk when we talk about the 90s. You never even questioned capitalism in the 90s. Not you as Pascal, but I mean, when we watch movies like Boys in the Hood and all these other hood films, they never bring capitalism.
What I want to explain I'm not going to explain anything to Janice Graham because she forgot more about Black history and Black people than I could know in 10 years. But the point of the matter is that our generation, my generation, Generation X, took Black capitalism to the umpteenth degree because in the 80s, Black popular culture was capitalized in a way that it hadn't been before. That's the first time you're seeing Black athletes with multi-million-dollar contracts. You're seeing Black filmmakers, multi-million-dollar films. You're seeing hip-hop rappers who couldn't sing a lick and not play a single instrument getting multi-million-dollar deals. And that value system, which was born of the fact that we were growing up in the reactionary conservative Reagan era, was replicated by many of my generation as a good thing. And what you're seeing now with certain, quote unquote, Black voices of the hip hop generation, if you will, is that they are recycling Nixonian type Black capitalism. Got a bank at a Black bank, as if that worked in 72. Why exactly is oppression by a Black capitalist better than a white capitalist, except I can say ashe when he doesn't give me health care?
Isn't that what we need? We need more Black Bezoses, right?
Yeah. When people say all this, support Black business, support Black banks, I hate banks. Why is a Black one supposed to make me feel better? Because
it's going to be nicer, and you get like an
ashe, brother.
And that means
that demonic usury interest rate at your bank.
You didn't know that? That's what it is. When you get
or I'm going to feel better when I can say, yes, this brother has a wonderful McDonald's while he's cohorting with people who are trying to fight for 15 and trying to make sure these fools don't have no Medicare for all. Isn't Black business a wonderful expression of our achievements as a people? Now,
prepaid debit card.
Laugh and Jim and Jason is laughing because Jason knows that there are folks who think this way.
Yeah.
Who market this stuff this way. Lots of them. Now, am I telling you, you shouldn't have listen, I used to have 2 businesses. I had my own law firm and I had a real estate title company. I'm not saying, and this is a question we're going to have about Marxism and entrepreneurialism, communism versus socialism. I am not anti-entrepreneurial per se, but I think that you can have models of business that are cooperative, where you give ownership of production to your employees. There are varying ways we can structure business models where they can be entrepreneurial, yet still are not totally parasitic, like the kind of zero-sum capitalist model we have today in society. But just to address my dear sister and mentor, Janice Graham, I do agree that most working class and poor Black folk are regulated into capitalism. But the media infrastructure and the hyper-capitalization of Black popular culture creates a small cadre of black folk who celebrate capitalism and create an enticement of get paid, get money, get paid mentality over those folks who are being most victimized by the system.
I want to just read some comments real quick. We have some Joe Payne, who has a podcast too, says, hell yeah, Cedric and the doctor are back on. This is not Cedric. This is Pascal. I know his voice does kind of sound like Cedric, and I don't have any pictures of Cedric up, but this is Pascal Robert. He writes for Black Agenda Report. Cedric said he's going to be on next week. We're doing a big year-end show with Pascal, myself, Touré Reed, and Cedric Johnson. I just have a new clip with Cedric that's up, but this is not Cedric. This is Pascal. They both are bald. They are colored gentlemen. Pascal, you will know the difference between him and Cedric. Cedric is from New Orleans, so he's smooth. He's real jazzy when he talks. Pascal's from New York, so he's abrasive. and we have another comment from YouTube. LME. Absolutely everyone loved you if you were black and said you were about liberal business in those days. I think people still love you now. Killer Mike has his own prepaid debit card. You're not an asshole. You just didn't know what Cedric looked like. Someone else thinks that's funny.
I wanted to address a comment somebody said on the scroll here about that the rate of unemployment is an undercount. And yeah, I want to sort that. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, which tracks these statistics, had been, the unemployment rate goes back to 1948, right? So, and for decades, the BLS had been criticized mostly by left economists and Marxists who said, you're not counting everybody. You're leaving out people who have just given up looking for work, right? I mean, because the stipulation is you have to be actively seeking employment during the last 4 weeks, and that's a pretty stringent requirement, as it turns out. So there's a lot of people who couldn't find work, and then they went back to school, or they did other things, or it's like life's complicated, right? So if you're not actively seeking, then you're not considered unemployed. And there's actually a fair number of people who are in that category. And so the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the 90s, they said, okay, we're going to get in a nod to the critics. They said, we're going to introduce a new unemployment rate, which they called the U6, which incorporated some of these criticisms. So I actually think we should just be using the U6. That's a much broader, and I think overall better measure of unemployment that has fewer of those issues than the standard one that's reported, which is the U3.
There's another question. I'm giving Janice a lot of people, and listen, Janice Graham is a over 35-year veteran of Black radio. I've been on her show multiple times. If you're wondering why I'm paying attention to her questions, is because she's a woman I love like an aunt. She's also been a mentor to me in this medium endeavor, and she was supporting my writing when it was just my Thought Merchant blog and no one knew who I was. So I always give her respect and admiration. She makes a very powerful statement here. The corporate capitalist has no resistance from the masses because there is no infrastructure from which blacks can resist. And I think there's truth to that. There is no black left infrastructure. There is no left political infrastructure. And we should ask, in the 50-year counter-revolution, which is I call this period from the rise of Nixon to today, what happened to the infrastructure of the black left? Did they just get subsumed into academia? Or did they get subsumed into foundation work, getting paid, doing left work on capitalist dime, the nonprofit industrial complex? Or is, a lot of them, some of them were taken out by COINTELPRO, but not all of them. Did some of them become capitalists? Did some of them just get paid? And one of the things that we see as our job here at This Is Revolution is that we may be a small little pebble, if at best, in trying to build that black left infrastructure that was so rigorous and necessary for all of us to get all of the things we got from the civil rights movement. Let's not forget Bayard Rustin was once a capitalist. Let's not forget a communist, Ella Baker was once a communist. Let's not forget that A. Philip Randolph was known as a socialist. So
those are the people that kind of put together the march, the 64 march,
right, which was a march for labor and rights. That don't forget the labor component,
jobs and
so
freedom.
these people who come out of this Marxist, leftist, challenging capitalism, imperialism, racism, and sexism tradition were crucial to ending Jim Crow in this country. And if we don't go back to tying the racial oppression that Black folk have to capitalism and imperialism and fighting sexism, we're going to be stuck taking whatever chips and fatback and biscuits the neoliberal order wants to give Black folk and thinking we have arrived, when the majority of Black folk who are poor and working class will still be being ground to powder. And that's serious talk. And we need to stop believing that, what some of our more pedigreed elites think is a solution for all Black people is the best for the Black people who are being ground to powder the most.
Would you say that the left kind of, Pascal, you and I watched a real cool clip of Boots Riley talking with Breonna Joy Gray a few weeks ago, talking about how the left abandoned the working class in general. Do you think that abandonment, and I pose this question to Dr. Bair and of course you, Pascal, do you think the abandonment of the left from the working class to academic circles, right? We can't lie. A lot of these guys went to academic circles. And do you think that's a big reason why we are so disconnected from this socialist, this past?
I think that leftism in America is a phenomenon of upper echelon, upper middle class, pedigreed whites who, but for the subprime mortgage crash in 2008, would be watching the Dow for their stock dividends, and who basically got swept up in Occupy and Bernie Sanders, which is not bad, and became the quote unquote spokesman / gatekeepers of what is quote unquote the left. And because there is no, and Janice, I agree with you, there is no Black left. We just have Black leftists. I always say you can fit the Black left in one midnight diner on the Jersey Turnpike, or one high school basketball court. All right. We have Black leftists. We don't have a Black left. We don't have the infrastructure. But guess what? We don't have a white left. We have white leftists. We don't have a left that functions to influence policy and politics that makes the ruling class quiver at our demands the same way the ultra-reactionary right does for their flank of the aisle. And we haven't had a left like that since, frankly, the McCarthy era and the United Front era as well. And Dr. Bair, I would love for you to talk about what was the United Front or the Popular Front, and how I argue that once we started having communists, anarchists, socialists, and Marxists for the Democrats in America, like we have today on Foundation dime, it made the left more of a joke than it already is. So I'd like you to talk about how the Popular Front or the United Front to fight fascism was the first major step in castrating the left in America, if you can. Assuming you agree with my analysis.
The Democratic Party has a real problem. The problem is they use the language of the left and claim to be, for the working class, or they don't actually use the term working class, right? They use the term middle class, because that's America's particular mythology, right? Which is that everybody either is or could be middle class. And that's never been true, but that is the kind of foundational myth that especially the Democrats deal with. Over time they have constructed the working class or the middle class to be white, right? I mean, And I find this very, very troubling, right? Because the right is also doing this. The right is now openly using this phrase, working class, but sometimes they put white along with it. I think this is very, very troubling, right? Because that has a very particular meaning, right? They mean we care about workers if they're white, right? I mean, that's very, very dangerous, right? I mean, it's a natural outgrowth.
Also disingenuous because the majority of black people are working class.
Right.
Black people are the most, by the way, for you guys who are anti-union, black people in America are the most unionized ethnic demographic in this country. Look at the statistics, that's a fact.
And unions are an excellent way of blunting some of capitalism's worst excesses. So, unions and unionization, I mean, it's not a coincidence that we've gotten, capitalism has kicked up a notch in terms of its ravages in the last 40 or 50 years, and the unionization rate has been going down during that same period. So that's not a coincidence, right? So, the Democrats have this contradiction, which is they have to act like they're the friend of the left, but they don't want to actually do anything either, right? Because they are beholden to their corporate masters. So, then they do a lot of stuff that ends up being very fragmenting, right? I think the question is about how are we moving away from a united front era into a much more fragmented and less threatening left, right? A left that doesn't really wield any political power, a left that is talked down to, is say, get on board and vote blue no matter who and whatever. But we're not going to actually accede to any of your demands. We're not even going to ask you what they are, right? We're just, we're just going to kind of beat you over the head with that club, right? And yeah, I mean, that is the situation. That's where we're at. And I think that the question is, we need to unify, but around what, right? I mean, I think that's kind of the topic that we're getting at in this show tonight.
All right, and I'm going to say something, Professor Bair. I'm going to be very blunt. I've said this before, and I say it. Listen, racial coalition politics is not about I love the white people, we got to get with the white people. Let's make this clear. Racial coalition politics is about the reality that black people are 14% of the population, and the material policies that black people need to improve their condition is not going to be able to be achieved individually in a racial silo, simply because the class politics within Black America will be used as a weapon against those materialist politics, like it was done in 2016 with the Black political class being used to neutralize whatever you think about the Sanders movement. And there are plenty of reasons to critique, but the fact that there was a materialist-based politics to the left of the norm of the Democratic Party that was neutralized because of the way in which Black politics was weaponized in 2016, 2020. So what I'm saying is that the same way there will be no left in America without Black people, the same way Black people need to maintain the racial integrity of their own left organizing, but create racial coalitions that don't sacrifice that integrity, united around a working class and poor people's vision of challenging capitalism for materialist policies and politics that improve the poor and working class overall, that will disproportionately benefit Black people. If you don't think class politics works for Black people, ask your grandmother if she likes her Social Security and Medicaid and Medicare. Ask her if she wants that to go away.
Right.
Well, I don't know if you guys been following some of these cabinet picks, but I forget the exact job the gentleman has. But one of Biden's new cabinet picks has been as a fervent Social Security. He wants to cut it. Hawk. Thank you. Social Security hawk. So,
and these people need to be fought. See, the thing about neoliberalism, right? And neoliberalism is a fancy way for privatization. The government privatizes and marketizes its services while you still pay taxes, but you have no fiduciary relationship with the people who are providing those government services. Fiduciary means that you kind of have an organic, almost kind of quasi-legal relationship with the entity. When you have privatization, you have no fiduciary relationship with the private individuals running your government services because you don't vote for them. So they can screw you, raise the prices, decrease the quality of the services, and you get jacked up. But at least when the government is providing you those services because you elect the government, you pay taxes to the government, you have a fiduciary relationship with the government, and you can challenge them on those fiduciary grounds. So neoliberalism becomes an economic model that cannibalizes the social function of government at the behest of private corporations and companies, and always leaves citizens shortchanged, just like when electricity was neoliberalized through privatization in California, water in other parts of the country, et cetera, and it leaves citizens hanging out to dry. In this parasitic form of capitalism, we have to realize that both the Republicans, which are toxic, racist, horrible people, and the Democrats, who are a different type of toxic and a different type of racist, horrible people, have both created a consensus to promote neoliberalism. Because in the 50-year counter-revolution we're talking about, in which Milton Friedman rises and things of that nature, the consensus was, after the movement in the 70s, that we're going to move in this consensus where we're going to move government out the way. We'll create race-specific policies, create a small black middle class, and we're going to push the rest of black folk into prison, mass incarceration, drug use, et cetera, et cetera.
I want to add, Janice Graham says, but there are no people in the street on the issue of economic murder. Joe Biden has taken us back to less chaos and more oppressive government and silence. My big issue with the Biden administration, and I've been saying it for some time on a lot of my past shows, is that once Donald Trump is gone, then the media fervor around him is gone. And a lot of the radicalism that we see now, especially in a lot of young people, even people like our age, because you see Donald Trump ad nauseum on the TV saying the most ridiculous and vile things over and over and over again, it really got people engaged. Joe Biden is maybe the most boring president we've seen since what? Ford? He's causing a lot of damage already with his cabinet. We know that. And we know just with his policies of 40 plus years in office, the man's a wrecking ball, but he will not get the coverage that Donald Trump got in the slightest. And he will be able, or this administration will be able to pass so much more through without the scrutiny of having major news networks and then the chattering left internet space just going over Donald Trump again and again and again and again and again and again and again. And I think that's what's going to keep people, unfortunately, from organizing. I mean, in my conversation with Cedric Johnson, I have a clip of that up. The reason when we got into the discussion was I was saying, do you think that the protests that we saw this spring and summer had a lot to do with Donald Trump, a reaction to his overreactionary behavior? So that's just,
there's ways that Biden is going to be worse. I mean, Trump did run as an anti-war candidate. I think, anybody who paid attention to his run, he criticized the U.S. military. He said, we don't need to be in all these countries. That's interesting. Now, he didn't govern that way, but Biden ran as a hawk. Biden ran to the right of Trump on the issue of imperialism. And he said, oh, we're going to get tough on Russia. That's interesting, right? I mean, I think that the U.S. presidency is already structurally imperialist. It's very, very difficult to resist that, even if you wanted to. But, there are degrees of it, I think. So, Biden is in some ways, I think, to the rest of the world. I mean, we'll see. But he might well be be worse than the Trump administration in that way.
Yeah,
I think that's a fair argument on foreign policy. I do see one of the most dangerous things I see about Biden is that he openly embraced the neoconservatives that helped put together Bush's war on terror, which gutted Iraq and set the Middle East on fire.
Mm-hmm.
But in the same time, I don't think in any way we should romanticize Trump. Trump is he's a vile just personality for a whole variety of reasons. But we have to understand that the choices are limited, and what we have as a choice, the Democratic Party's purpose is not to follow or support a left agenda. The purpose of the Democratic Party is to neutralize a left agenda in the name of being liberal, to in the end coalesce with their right-wing flank around this similar agreed upon policy: neoliberalism, imperialism, etc., etc. In other words, the Democrats are Republicans who won't use the N-word.
Fair enough.
Right? And so
that's fair.
Racist stuff.
You
may get certain policy concessions from them, but the parties now are wedded to an economic model that is not about wealth redistribution, not about government public goods governance, rooted in serving the working class and poor. And that's where our politics, bipartisan, is right now. And that's why it's so crucial for us to not only rebuild the left, to rebuild a strong black left that I believe should not only be in coalition with the white left to challenge this institutional transigence, but oftentimes may need to take the lead, because these folks might not be as wedded to their cushy tenure jobs or their trust funds or their foundation dime or their hobnobbing with neocons that some of our white left quote unquote comrades have demonstrated themselves willing to be.
We have a question for Dr. Bair. Dr. Bair, why can't the left be better organized? Do we have to remove people who don't serve the interests of the working class / poor? When you say remove, do you mean like or just remove them?
I wish we had that kind of power. Oh, remove him. I don't like his politics. Get rid of him out of there. I don't think we're at that point. I think that we work around simple issues that have broad appeal. I mean, Bernie showed us this, right? That he said, I'm going to run on a simple platform, right? I mean, free college, $15 minimum wage, right? $15 an hour minimum wage, and healthcare. I'm going to run on that.
Federal jobs guarantee. How about that? Let's take it there.
The
Federal
jobs guarantee. Yeah, I mean, these are simple ideas that are easy to communicate and that have a very broad appeal. I would add two things to it. I mean, if we're talking about it, I would say, let's cut taxes, right? Let's take that issue away from the right, because the right loves to talk about this. Taxes are too high. They are legitimately too high. And the reason that they're too high is because we spend $1.25 trillion a year on imperialism, on the military, right? That is far, far too much. We could have lower taxes and much better services. We could have a much better quality of life.
We can keep the taxes, cut the military budget, and defer those funds to a public goods form of governance.
Yeah, I mean, what we need a public goods form of government of some kind, right? We don't have that currently. So I think we unify around some simple ideas that don't require labels and don't require, oh, are you this or that sub ideology? Who cares?
I'm glad you said that, because Jason and I have been talking about that for a while. The problem with the current just trust fund gentrifying left. They get so sucked up in their theory that they don't make any appeals to working class.
You teach at a college level, so I'm sure you see it a lot coming through your classroom.
I teach at a community college, so I mean, I teach to largely the working class. I mean, not exclusively, because it's like any college, right? Is you get all kinds of people, and I think a lot of Californians. I mean, first of all, community college in California is very, very good, right? It's the California poured resources into the community college system, which is excellent, right? I mean, that makes higher education accessible. Now, you still have a lot of the problems, which is, textbooks are expensive, paying for the credits, even though it's much cheaper than anything else, it's still going to cost you a few $100s per semester. And, that's a bar. It should be completely free. I mean, honestly, we should be paying people to get educated. It's a work, after all. You don't work for free. You don't pay to work, right? You should be paid to do it. It's for the benefit of society. But we're not at that point, right? But I think when you talk about these issues to people in the classroom, I mean, there's plenty of conservatives and so on that I talk to. But if you frame it as like, I think everybody should have healthcare, I think we can do that. And here's how it would save money, by the way, right? I mean, I think that sweetens the deal a little bit.
We have a great question from Janice I want to get to again, because Janice, as a radio talker, she knows how to ask these really good questions. We have to get real about the support of capitalism within the labor movement and organizations. They fight neoliberalism to retain jobs, but support capitalism in their policy. Let's talk about labor union bureaucracy and how they oftentimes throw their own working class union members under the bus to maintain their relationships with the Democratic Party. Not an unknown phenomenon.
Do you think that has a lot to do with removing the socialists from the union movement during the McCarthy era?
I think that has a lot to do with many factors. Yes, but that's one of them. But Dr. Bair, I'd like to hear you chime in on that.
The labor union is definitely less militant in terms of its composition. I mean, you're always going to find radicals, and they exist. But I think that they're put in an awkward position. In the labor movement, you're put in an awkward position because your politics are secondary, right? It's not, the job of union organizing or union administration is to get these particular workers a better contract, right? And, that has to be kind of like your overriding focus, right? So, like if you're a communist or whatever, I mean, that's something you kind of do on your own time. You're not like in a communist organization, right? You're in a union. So, I mean, I'm active in my own union of faculty members, and like I can tell you, most of my colleagues are liberals. I mean, I'm not saying that as a pejorative. I'm just like, that's just the reality, right? Because it's not like we talk about the nature of capitalism in our meetings, right? I mean, that's not what it's about, right? It's about, these particular issues.
Oh God, another union meeting with Marx.
Everyone read Das Kapital for the meeting. No, it's not like that,
I just want to say this. First of all, thank you, Dr. Bair, again for coming on the show. Also, thank you, Janice Graham, for commenting and even paying attention to what we're doing here. Really appreciate you watching the show. I just want to point something out, kind of about the whole show is does Marxism have value for Black Americans? I went and saw Richard Wolff towards the end of last year in Berkeley, California, not too far from the campus. And the makeup of the audience was mainly older, white, middle-class people. And it made me kind of sad because the message that he had was one that resonated with me. And I know, I'm like, man, if this, I could take this guy to the barbershop right now and he would get cats fired up. So again, I appreciate you coming on and wanting to have this conversation, because Pascal and I think this is an extremely important conversation us to be having, especially at a time like right now, where we put so much pressure on, not pressure, but like, Jim Clyburn was the deciding factor in ending the Bernie Sanders campaign, right? He's not going to win South Carolina. So we put all this pressure on the Black vote, on Black people in general, and they just keep selling us shoes at the end of the day, right? So to have a different outlook to have a class analysis. I find it so important. So thank you for coming on, and of course, Pascal, thank you for just being you.
Absolutely. You know, I brought Richard Wolff to our campus at Riverside City College where I teach, and I'll tell you, I was nervous about it because city colleges, community colleges often don't have a speaker circuit. They don't have that very well developed, right? Because the students are busy, they're working, they have family obligations, they do their classes, right? Go to a talk outside of that, right? I mean, that's not part of the culture, to be honest, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, I was like, well, I want to not only bring him, but also have to promote this, right? Like, and so, you know, we did that. I optimistically put him in the largest lecture hall that they have on the campus, and it was totally and completely packed. He spoke for an hour, and then he answered questions for another 2 hours, and the line just went out the door, right? Mm-hmm. And, you know, I mean, community college is very, very diverse, you know, a lot of young people, right? And you could just see the kinds of questions. I mean, it's kind of like the polar opposite of what you're describing, right? Like this wealthy, middle-class, older audience or whatever. I mean, you know, this is young people, and, you know, it was fascinating to hear what kinds of questions people asked. And I think there is this kind of organic interest. You know, it's not necessarily people who, you know, are studying this stuff or anything, right? They're just people who are looking around and seeing capitalism is not working. It's not living up to its billing, you know. And what could we do instead, you know? And let's here's somebody who has some thoughts on that, right? So I think there's a tremendous amount of organic interest in it because, I mean, like Malcolm X said, right? Capitalists are bloodsuckers, and, you know, you kind of know when your blood's being sucked.
But there's also like a disconnection that Pascal and I talk about with kind of Black people and the radical king, right? The socialist king. King stops for a lot of people with having a dream. Not even the whole speech, just the last part of the speech, and that's king for a lot of people. Malcolm X is just supposed to be the opposite side of that coin, right? He's forever remembered holding the assault rifle, looking out of his window, right?
Yet both of them died fighting capitalism and imperialism.
Yeah.
That's when they were killed.
Thank you.
I'm getting a question here asking about worker co-ops and Richard Wolff. Yeah, I mean, as it was mentioned at the beginning of the show, I studied with Richard Wolff at UMass Amherst, and you know, his kind of basic message is that a lot of focus has been put on, in terms of socialism and communism, a lot of focus has been put on the macro level of society. So the government, revolution, right? Do the workers control the government? This is macro level stuff, right? This is big picture stuff. And not very much focus was put on the micro level, right? That is, okay, you're at your job. Well, who is doing the work? And then who takes or appropriates the products of that labor? Do you have any say in that, right? Is somebody else taking the surplus, right? Is it you along with your fellow workers, right? And so, you know, we have to kind of pay attention to both of these. And I think, you know, his basic point is we just have not had enough focus on what is going on in the actual workplace, right? And, you know, what we've seen from the socialist countries that have existed is that, you know, especially if we look at the Soviet case, right? This is the first workers' revolution that was successful. What they did, by and large, especially if we look at their factories, is they replaced the private capitalist with the state, right? And they were very explicit about that. They said, we do not have a very well-developed form of capitalism. We need to rapidly develop it. And the best way to do that, and this is the words of Lenin, right, is through state capitalism. That's what they call it, right? Now, later on, they called that socialism, right? So, you know, this is we're trying to take steps towards abolishing exploitation, but it might be that an intermediate step is, well, you're still being exploited in the sense that somebody else is taking your surplus, but now at least it's by a state government who at least kind of has our backs, right? at least is going to work for the public good, especially of the most marginalized. And that was seen as a first step. Now, no one wanted that to be the final step, right? The final step was a stateless, classless, moneyless society where everyone should, I mean, a kind of utopia, right? But, you know, the thinking was that would take a while to get to, right? We come from a legacy of exploitation, whether it be slavery or feudalism or capitalism. In the Soviet Union, of course, they had experience with all of these, right? So abolishing exploitation is a long-run project. We do have to pay attention to the micro level, right? That is, so the question was about worker co-ops. A worker co-op, of course, is, you know, this is an enterprise within capitalism that produces commodities, sell those commodities, but it doesn't have bosses, right? The workers themselves are the bosses, right? They
also share in the revenue of production as well.
Right.
I'm a big fan of worker co-ops, and I see it as a beneficial alternative to capitalism, and I would call it a socialist paradigm if implemented in a way in which ownership of all corporations become part of a cooperative, meaning all private companies that are publicly traded, 1/3 of their revenue and profits goes to every member of society. 1/3 would go to the private revenues owners who created the business enterprise, and 1/3 would go to the state as a means of generating revenue, and you wouldn't need taxes. And I also believe in removing interest-based lending because it's parasitic, and have an equity-based lending system.
Well,
that's my model.
That actually leads into our first show of the new year, where we actually speak with the Debt Collective, who actually is putting together literal debt collectives to abolish a lot of debt that people do have. We're coming up on our hour and a half. Are you guys ready to call it?
Yeah, we should call it, because when the show's too long, it turns people off. But I didn't even get to half of the questions I wanted to ask you. I think we need to ask Dr. Bair to come on and we should have a part 2 of this, because there's so many ways we can go with this. I think he realizes we weren't just two angry black men who were trying to chop his head off. So
well, Dr. Bair,
I never thought that. I just didn't want to be seen as, you know, some kind of white expert who's dictating to.
You mean the typical white savior who comes in on his horse to save the?
You're not Michelle Pfeiffer. This isn't one of those hood movies.
I don't want to see on Twitter. I don't want to see like my face and then the tagline, you know, like that kind of thing, right? I will get probably dragged for that on Twitter. So
no.
You got to say fuck those people.
We are comfortable enough in our intellectual acumen that we can have a white person on our show to be interrogated about his values and not feel that he's our savior at all. And I think that kind of thinking also is a problem when you're looking for answers because sometimes people may look like you have answers, which I'm sure there are plenty black Marxists we could have had on, but fortunately, Jason already had this relationship with you. And I think you addressed some of those questions quite well. There's a lot more that we can interrogate more on those issues. In terms, for example, someone's asking me for a book that has the works of Thomas Sankara, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King and their socialist views. It's a very good question.
Yep.
I'd have to search.
We need to go back to having a book recommendation, because I used to do on this live stream, I would have like reading recommendations every week of books to look at. You want Sankara's speeches? Is there a book with Sankara's speeches?
They have to be translated in English. He spoke French. I'm a big fan of Thomas Sankara.
There's a ton. I will say this right now. On YouTube, there's a great, I think it's about 45-minute documentary on Sankara and the rise of Burkina Faso. There's a lot of interviews. I believe they have. Oh, what was that conference called that they had and where all the African leaders got together?
There's a great documentary on YouTube. If you are not familiar with Thomas Sankara and his importance as a communist African leader in Burkina Faso, is Thomas Sankara, the Upright Man. Thomas Sankara, the Upright Man. Go check out that documentary to learn about Thomas Sankara and his politics. Also, another book important to show the interface of Pan-Africanism and global Pan-African unity with socialism and Marxism is Cuba, the African Odyssey, which talks about how Fidel Castro sent his own soldiers in the 70s and in the 80s to fight on the African continent to liberate African countries from their European colonial rulers. Cuba and African Odyssey. Great two-part documentary. You should know this history, and you should know why it demonstrates the value of socialist or Marxist or communist analysis and politics mixed with Pan-Africanism, and how it literally led to the liberation of Black people in the African diaspora. These are things that people don't want you to know in the United States. You should know this.
And I can't stress it enough. We're having an end of the year show. Cedric Johnson, Touré Reed, Pascal, myself. I probably just been moving out of the way and asking them a question or two and letting them riff, because those guys have some great riffs. But I will also be peppering in clips of 90s hood films, because that shit is hilarious to me when they go off on it, and there's just certain scenes that you do have to rewatch as a grown-ass man.
I want to shout out to my Haitian sister, Keskiosity, who shouted me out. She's watching the live stream. I'm really impressed that she did that. She is a phenomenal consumer of podcasts. She knows the podcast Left Culture well. And for her to take our show seriously enough that she came to watch it, I'm really honored that she did that. That means she saw some value in us. If she missed any of it, please, you guys, check when the YouTube link comes up. Check out the whole series, the whole segment. Check out our earlier work together, and send this out to all your people, even your conservative Black friends and white friends. Send it out to all of them.
I was going to say something. You said that shit like Joe Biden, and they're just as good as white people. We should start talking about white people like Joe Biden talk about everybody else. And then the white people came to me and they wanted to touch my hair. They said he's got crazy hair. I want to touch it. For some reason, my Joe Biden sounds like Bill Cosby. I'm sorry. Joe Cosby.
Well, you guys ask great questions, and you have a lot of great insights, and so of course I'd be happy to come back anytime you want to continue the conversation.
Jason, someone's asking to put those documentaries in the show notes when you post it on YouTube.
I will do that. Also, it's the wrap up of the show. So thank you, Dr. Bair, once again. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel. You can see Dr. Bair on the show with Gloria LaRiva. You can see Dr. Bair on the show with Shahid Buttar. Like I love this guy. He's like the show economist. He's taken over where Arash Kolahi was. Arash Kolahi was our show economist, and Dr. Bair came in and just was like, move out of the way, Arash. And so my mom is commenting now.
I'm a big fan of Arash Kolahi, actually, and we've become friends through Twitter, and then have talked after that, and a very good economist as well.
He's great. Arash Kolahi is the reason why I have I got a lot of guests on my show, because they went back to listen to the show that he was on. He's got like yourself, a very great perspective. He puts things in a way that's very easy to understand. I don't know if it was you, Dr. Bair, or somebody else was talking about how people always say, these guys on the left go, you need to read your theory. And someone goes, what's better than that? Explaining that shit to somebody, because these are hard reads.
Yeah.
Pascal and I were talking about reading Cedric Robinson.
It's nice if you can have a conversation and then go to the reading and then have another conversation. I mean, that's what sort of brings the text to life, right? If you're just on your own with the text, that's difficult. But if you're in a dialogue with it, then it makes it more fun.
Are super chats too capitalistic for the show? They are not. I just always forget to ask people for money, because I'm not very good at it.
It's very important to support left media. I would encourage everybody who found value in the show to contribute. We live in this capitalist world where an income is necessary in order to produce anything So I really encourage everybody to support the show.
And if you would like to support the show, we do actually have a Patreon. Here's the link to it. If you want to help the show grow, if you're in a position to help, give it as a Christmas present. There is bonus content that we have. There's actually some bonus content from the Touré and Pascal conversation. Joe Payton was asking about listening to Touré play the guitar. We actually got into a pretty long music discussion about some of the instruments that I have here and music. Touré and I are going to do another show again, probably part 2 of racism and heavy music. So if you can become a patron, if you're watching on YouTube, if you have a YouTube, please hit that subscribe button. That also helps us when it comes to
hit like, share, subscribe.
Like, share, and subscribe. Follow us on Twitter. Please follow Dr. Bair on Twitter. He is sometimes I don't like everything you say, not because I don't like it. It's because I'm so busy reading you clown people that try to get on you for being I believe you say on your thing you're a communist on your Twitter profile, right?
Yeah, I think it's important to put that out there. I'm not a fan of watering it down. I don't think this is a moment where we water stuff down, This is a moment where we be our authentic selves. And if I'm honest, then I'm going to say, yeah, I'm a communist,
And you definitely take on all comers because people definitely come at you with some silly shit.
I'm glad I can provide some entertainment value then.
Definitely. So thank you guys very much for checking this out, and we will see you next Tuesday for the special year-end episode.
Sounds good.